Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfic. Today will be the continuation of Yuuei Survival Guide. This will be Part 10, Chapter 10. Izuku doesn't remember falling asleep in his mother's room. He doesn't remember sinking to the floor with his back against the bed, face tucked into his knees and arms clutching around them like a lifeline. But that's how he'd woken up. Sore and stiff, eyes dry and irritated. The paper, his mother's note, had been refolded and grasped in his hand the entire night. It's a little wrinkled now, new folds in the paper from where he'd held it too tight in his sleep. The note brings back the numbness from the night before, but he's kind of glad that he's numb. He'd rather numbness than heartbreak. It's the better option. He sits on the floor for a while before managing to pull himself up. His body moves on autopilot as he treks himself through the apartment, feet dragging more than stepping. It feels colder now. Bigger than what he's used to. He feels small. It doesn't feel real, but the note in his hand is very much so. A tiny part expects him to find his mother in the kitchen or sitting in the living room. It's dumb. I'm sorry. She's not, of course. He is alone. The apartment remains the same it had been when he'd made his way into her room. His books and papers are all scattered on the table, half completed. He drops heavily into his chair from the night before, feeling more exhausted than he had when he'd fallen asleep. The note sits before him, turned upside down on top of his math assignment so he can't see his name. Looking at it hurts his heart, but seeing his name in her scrawl shatters it completely. He doesn't have enough money for rent. He barely has enough money to buy himself school lunches and instant ramen to tide himself over until the next lunch. He'd spread that allowance he'd been given as thinly as he could, but it still wasn't enough. Soon he'd have none left, which meant that he'd have no food. Izuku lets his head fall down onto the table, straying his fingers away from the note as if it had burned him. Now isn't the time to give up. He can't let this hurt him. Not now. He was a UA student, a Hero Course student. He'd been living alone for a long time now, but he'd never done it alone. His mother had always made sure that he had everything he needed, even if she wasn't really around. She fed him and clothed him, made sure he had an education and a roof over his head. But he was alone now. There was no help. She'd left. She'd left without a word, just like his father. She'd packed up and moved out her belongings. Left when he was gone, or in the middle of the night, he's not sure. No one was going to help him. No one knew, and frankly, he's not sure anyone would even want to help him. He didn't have his mom, or his dad, not anymore. No family. He was really alone. But could he do it alone? He'd have to try. He wasn't going to give up. How could he be a hero if he gave up when things got tough? It was a learning curve. This would make him stronger. He'd learn from this. Izuku pulled in a ragged breath, glancing down at his homework before pushing himself up from his chair. He wasn't going to sit around while everything he'd worked so hard for crumbled. The cool morning breeze assaulted his face when he stepped out of the apartment doors. He hadn't bothered pulling on a sweater or a jacket. In fact, the chill washed over the numb feeling that had settled in his bones and made him feel. He shivered lightly as he stepped away from the doors, happy the fact that he wasn't as numb as he felt. He'd spent a great deal of his time thinking, worrying. He was alone now. His mother had left just as his father, and it's not like they have any close family friends that he could turn to. Kachan wouldn't care, and he didn't know where he stood with Auntie. When his friendship with Kachan crumbled away, he'd slowly stopped seeing the woman as well, even though their parents had been really close friends. He thinks briefly of telling his sensei about what had happened, or even mentioning it to Hound Dog or Present Mike, but he thinks better of it. They don't need to worry about him outside of school. He already causes enough problems in school as it is, and what if they didn't care? What would he do then? He's not sure he could pick himself back up again if it was proven that he really was alone in all of this. He was slowly starting to trust his teachers, but what if he was wrong? Izuku shoves his frozen fingers into the pockets of his jeans. He's glad he had half a mind to change out of his school uniform, even if the blazer jacket would have added some additional warmth. The thin shirt does little to protect him from the morning chill, but at least he'd opted for a long-sleeve shirt instead of a t-shirt. He knows he can't do nothing. He can't survive if he does nothing. He needed a means to feed himself. He had pocket change, the remainder of what he'd been given at the start of the school year, but that's almost gone. His money had dwindled down with each passing meal, and soon he'd have none left. At this point, he could barely afford his next school lunch. He knew he wasn't going to steal anything, not money or food. He was training to be a hero, and that was against his morals. But he knew that he needed to feed himself. He couldn't just stop eating, especially with One for All in him. So the first thing he'd done that Saturday morning was make his rounds to all of the shops in the neighborhood. He offered his services, cleaning windows, mopping floors, stocking convenience and grocery store shelves, bagging purchases. He'd offered to make deliveries for restaurants in the area, to clean and wait on tables. He offered to wash dishes or clean bathrooms or do any other annoying jobs that everyone always hated doing. He went into each store with a smile on his face and offered to do whatever they needed done, but whether it be manual labor or just a helping hand. But no one took him up on it. And he'd known that it was a possibility. He was 15, he hadn't prepared a resume in his description, and he probably didn't even look presentable. He hadn't really thought this through at all, just needed the money, and the only way to get the money was to work for it. One by one, the shops and small businesses shot him down. Apologetic smiles, pitying shakes of people's heads, soft declines. No one wanted to hire a teenager. They looked at him and saw a kid. No one trusts a kid without a resume, a kid with no past work experience, no one willing to give him a chance. Izuku was feeling down as early evening approached him. He'd been asking around all morning and afternoon, feet carrying him along the streets in and out of any shop that was open. He didn't plead or beg. That wouldn't help his case, but he asked kindly, making sure to smile. The rejection was starting to weigh on him. He tried to come off as friendly and reliable, responsible, but no one was willing to take the risk. He was on his way back to his apartment when he noticed a sign perched on the sidewalk. It was black, and written on it in curly, formal chalk lettering was, "Come in, we're open," along with the business's name stamped on the center top of the board, and a blocky arrow that pointed towards a door that Izuku had never noticed before. He'd never noticed the sign before, nor the door tucked away on the side of one of the buildings. He'd walked this path before, with his mother when he was little, and he'd passed by every day when walking to his junior high, so he's surprised that he'd never noticed it. He does as the sign suggests and walks into the little business. A bell above the door chimes his arrival, and friendly faces greet him from behind the counter. It was a small little coffee shop. There were maybe 6 small 2-seat tables spread along, as well as a coffee counter and a display of fresh baked goods. It didn't look like much from the outside, but the inside was bustling with activity, a hidden gem in the streets of his neighborhood. Izuku stepped into the small, 3-person-long line. His thoughts were on a warm drink to ease the ache and chill in his fingers. He's not sure if the cold stirred up the ache from his still-healing hands or if he was genuinely hurt, but he hopes that a warm drink will help him. When it's finally his turn, he orders a hot chocolate, hand digging into his pocket to pull out the change, just praying that he has enough to cover it. He does, thankfully. He feels bad passing over a handful of loose coins, but the woman takes it with a friendly smile. It's family-owned, as a lot of the business in his neighborhood are. And it appeared that the whole staff was related, parents, their children, maybe even a grandchild or two working the different jobs or running a small little cafe. They work fluidly, stepping around each other with ease, trying to keep the line moving with hot drinks and baked goods coming out. His hopes of being able to feed himself had slowly flickered away as he'd noticed it, watching as they worked. He stands with his hands jammed in his pockets waiting for his drink. He debates asking the question, already wallowing in the rejection that hasn't come yet. He still finds himself asking, desperation winning over. The woman making the drinks hands him his hot chocolate. She's older, one of the owners that he'd guessed by how he'd watched her order the others around firmly but kindly. He grabs the to-go cup with his bandaged hand, and her eyes linger on the bandages. He hesitates for a second, just a moment before speaking. I was wondering if you were looking to hire anyone. I'm in need of an after-school job, and I promise I'll be a good worker. I can do anything you need. He swallows roughly, wincing. I don't have a resume or any work experience, but I'm a fast learner. He's ready to accept defeat as she pauses. The woman who'd taken his order, this woman's daughter perhaps, glances over before returning her gaze to the customer before her. The older woman eyes him, looks him up and down like she's gauging his worth. He knows she'd noticed the handful of change that he'd used to buy the drink, and she'd seen his fingers and hands too. The wound's still healing. He hopes that she doesn't peg him a delinquent roughed up from fighting. He knows he doesn't look very good after a full day in the chilly air and constant rejection, from other businesses as well as his mother. Maybe she can read it all in his face, in his eyes, just how desperate he is. The woman lets out a drawn-out sigh, turning to the espresso machine behind her to prepare the next order, and he just knows that his face crumbles in defeat. "Okay," she sighs out, handing the espresso to the waiting man on Izuku's left, before scanning him again as she leans against the counter. "I'm sure we can find something for you to do." It was an under-the-table job, waiting on tables, cleaning and taking out the trash, making drinks and helping out in the kitchen to prepare for the next morning's baking. He wouldn't get close to minimum wage, but he would be paid out of pocket at the end of each shift. It wasn't actual employment, and he knew it wasn't a permanent, but there really wasn't anything official about it. It was something, and he'd have money again. She'd offered him 3 hours a day, every day, starting just after school. He jumped at the offer. How could he not? It was overly generous, and he was in desperate need. He knew it was a pity job, but it's not like he really had any other choice. He needed to eat, and it's not like he could start stealing. That was against everything that he stood for. So he'd started working. He earned his pay, and he did it with a smile on his face. "So," Oboro draws, when Izuku sits himself down at his desk in English, "where have you been? I dropped by your apartment like 4 times this weekend, and the only time that you were there, you were passed out on your homework, which is bad for the back, let me tell you. And where'd you run off to so fast after quirk training with Sho? You were like a ghost, and that's coming from a ghost." He'd seen Oboro at his weekend training session with Sensei, but he hadn't gotten the chance to speak with him. He'd left. He had needed to leave fast after he finished in order to make it to the coffee shop in time. The last thing he needed was to be tardy, arriving at the only job who'd even considered him. He'd also tried to leave without being noticed so he wouldn't have to shoo Oboro away. It was easier to just leave without him because the ghost couldn't follow him there, and he's like 95% sure that the ghost can't just locate him with magic locating powers. He needs to actually see where you're going before he can just find you there. But besides that, he hadn't seen Oboro at that morning's quirk training. Izuku assumes the ghost was with Present Mike instead, but he literally could have been anywhere. He's a ghost, a very secretive ghost. "I've been busy," Izuku replied, as he organized his belongings on the desk. He pushed the finished assignment from the last class up to the corner of his desk to hand in when Present Mike showed up. "I've been doing some work for a bit of extra money." "Oh?" Oboro cocks his head in interest. "Saving up to buy something?" Izuku rubs at the back of his neck, giving a hum of acknowledgement. He's not, unless keeping himself fed counts, but he's not going to tell the ghost that. The last time that Oboro had gotten into his business, he'd found himself telling Aizawa-sensei far more than he wanted to in that conference room. And sure, maybe it worked out in the end, but he still wasn't going to do it. "So, you going to tell me where you're working?" "No," Izuku huffs a laugh, shaking his head. "And you're not allowed to follow me either. I need to focus when I'm there, and that's hard when you're around." "It's my sparkling personality, isn't it?" Oboro gives a dramatic sigh, though his lip curled with disappointment. "Or, it's my boyish good looks, right?" "Sure," Izuku teases with a shrug. "Whatever you say." Oboro scoffs in offense, but it doesn't stay long. "Hey, listen, sorry about Friday, by the way. I know we didn't really see much of each other, and you were kinda spacey in English. I didn't want to push my luck, you know. Sometimes I gotta decide whether being there is helping or doing the opposite." Izuku gives a light nod, raising a hand to wave at one of his peers. Jiro, who walks in, returns the wave before plopping down at her own desk to listen to her music. "It's okay. I was just thinking, and I guess I got carried away. Mike-sensei checked in with me, though." "Good." Oboro's smile said that. "So you're feeling better, then?" Izuku lets a tiny smile lift onto his lips. "Yeah, I am." He's not, but he's definitely not going to say that. He still feels numb, like he will walk home one of these days to see his mother, but she's not going to be there. Logically, he knows that she's gone. He hasn't the faintest idea of where she is, but when he'd called her workplace from a payphone outside of the cafe, asking about where, or, just making himself known, they'd said that she'd quit weeks prior. She could be anywhere by now. I'm glad, his ghost friend smiles, unaware of Izuku's internal struggles. So, did you want to work on your quirk after school today? I think you're right that the more that we do it, the easier it'll be, right? Can't. Izuku lifted a shoulder and shrugged. I worked after school. Oberon's bottom lip juts out in a pout. Well, when's your next break? What days are you off then? We'll work on it then. Izuku shakes his head. I work every day after school, and most of the weekends, too. You... every day? The playfulness is gone from the ghost expression, replaced with a sour-looking one. Really? When do you, get a break then? Izuku shrugged, hunching forwards. He didn't have time for breaks. He needed to make money. He needed to attend his classes. He needed to attend his quirk training and counseling. He needed to keep working, because if he doesn't, he'll lose it all, and he can't do that. I'm fine. Izuku waves a hand, trying to ignore the calculating look in Oberon's gaze. Obero opens his mouth to respond, to dispute that, but before he can manage, President Mike walks into the room, grinning as he gives a loud greeting. Izuku shoots up, grabbing the paper from the edge of his desk to pass in before moving to greet the teacher, leaving the ghost to huff, already knowing that their conversation is over for now. There's just something about that makes him feel bad, but he can't put his finger on it. The days carry on. Each day Izuku wakes up early and catches the train to school. He does quirk training or counseling, respectively, before starting his classes like usual. He tries to keep up appearances, smiling at his peers and quelling any worry from his ghost friend, living with his living friends and his teachers. Tries to keep them all, recognizing his smile to the best of his abilities. After school is finished, he hops back onto the train and tries to do his homework on the trip home, but it makes him a little motion sick most of the time. He knows he doesn't have time to do it later between his hours at the cafe and how exhausted he is when he gets home, so he forces down the sick feeling and tries his hardest to answer all the questions. Maybe he'll have to start doing his homework at lunch? Wednesday had been the worst day of his week. He had apologetically informed the woman who'd hired him that he'd be late on Wednesdays due to the fact that it was a 1 day a week where he'd stay after school with his sensei, and she'd offered him the day off, but he couldn't do that because he needed the money, so instead he did his training and then arrived in to help close up the coffee shop instead. By the time he got home, he was dead on his feet, and he's sure that he wasn't much better the following day at school. He tried not to give his peers anything to be worried about, but he knew they all were. Just like his teachers, except now, instead of Aizawa-sensei and Mike-sensei studying him, all of his teachers were. It wasn't obvious, but he could see them looking away whenever he looked at them. He could see the confusion clouding their eyes when he'd yawn for the third time or catching his eyes slipping closed accidentally. All Might even tried to check in on him, leading him into one of those conference rooms that Aizawa-sensei had shown him and awkwardly asking if he was all right. He'd promised he was perfectly fine before launching into the progress with One for All that he'd made with Sensei, and that seemed to distract the number one well enough. It wasn't just All Might either. He could see the worry on both of his sensei's faces as well, but they weren't as awkwardly upfront about it. Well, President Mike had reminded him that he was always there to talk if needed. While Sensei hadn't really said anything, but he also hadn't pushed him quite as hard. None of that came close to any of the worry that was coming from Obero, though. It was getting harder to keep the ghost out of his business. Obero was persistent, following him around and worrying vocally. Where everyone else watched from afar, questioning him in roundabout ways, Obero certainly didn't. Izuku's not sure he'd ever met anyone as confident and persistently caring in his life. Maybe it was the lack of sleep making him more irritable than usual, but the ghost was starting to get on his nerves. By the time that Friday rolls around again, Izuku's exhausted. He'd barely had the time to sleep. He'd actually fallen asleep on the train with his homework in his lap. He'd lost his pencil somewhere, hadn't had the energy to try and find it. His shift at the cafe is long. Not in real time. He's not there for longer than 3 hours, like usual, but it feels a lot longer. It feels like he wipes the tables for hours on end, and he knows that he accidentally mixed up a few orders, too. Thankfully, people just laughed when he did it instead of getting offended. He was sure if someone had yelled at him, he'd have just started crying. He pretends he doesn't see the pitying looks from the owners and the staff that they send him as he stumbles over a tired and anxious apology. They let him leave 20 minutes early, sending him off with his pay for a full 3 hours and a paper bag of baked goods that the baker, the owner's husband, had promised were going to be thrown out, despite the fact that Izuku knew they'd just come out of the oven an hour or so earlier. He walks home on numb legs, barely managing to carry himself up to the apartment. And when he gets there, it feels like a tsunami washes over him as his gaze settles on the door. He wants to cry. With shaking fingers, he pulls the eviction notice off of the door, just enough to be able to read it without ripping it off. He scans over it as deep, heavy sigh rattles out of his lungs. Izuku lets his head thump against the door as his shoulders sag. He unlocks the door, unsurprised to find his key still works. Their landlord is far too kind. At this point, they're 2 weeks late for the rent, so he could have changed the locks, but he hadn't, not yet. Izuku knows that he couldn't have gotten rent together even if he had tried. He simply couldn't work enough while also putting as much effort into his hero classes, training, and schoolwork. He pushes the door open, and despite the pull to collapse in his bed or on the couch, he sets to work. He slowly began packing in preparation for this. He'd known this was coming from the moment that the landlord had knocked on the door to inquire about their rent. It's not like his landlord will just look the other way if he stopped paying rent, so he was a nice man, but he wasn't that nice, nor stupid. Izuku had just been riding it out for as long as he could. Clearly, his luck has run out. He had a duffel bag settled on his desk, filled so far with his hero analysis notebooks, some of his favorite All Might merch, an old photo album that he was surprised, yet entirely not at the same time, to find still tucked away. He'd grabbed some of his few photos off the wall, too, the ones from simpler times, when she liked him. The rest of the bag was filled with knickknacks and clothes, whatever he could shove in, things he couldn't bear to part with. It was the hardest thing that he'd ever have to do, selecting what was most important to him to jam into a single duffel bag that he was taking. He was sure his wiping sad and exhausted tears off of his cheeks as he zips it up. His backpack gets the same treatment, though it's mostly clothes. He jams his school uniforms, some of his favorite sweaters, and a couple of changes of clothes in beside his school supplies. He manages to fit his laptop, phone, and the corresponding chargers in it as well. He'd need those for school. Lastly, he slips on another sweater, an All Might one, a favorite of his, and then pockets the small stockpile of money that he'd managed to save between his school meals and travel expenses. He leaves a note of apology for the landlord on the table, silently feeling awful that he was leaving so much behind, but he really couldn't take a couch or an oven with him. He knows his landlord will have no ill intent about it, but it is a bit of extra work on his plate. He does really feel bad. Along with the note, Izuku leaves his own house key. He has no idea where his mother's is, but he leaves his just as proof that he's gone. The locks will probably be changed since both the keys aren't present and the landlord can't be sure that they didn't make any copies, but he still feels better for leaving it. He doesn't even want it anymore anyways. The teen gives the apartment his home for his whole life. One last glance before grabbing his duffel bag and easing the door shut behind him with a soft click. It's late enough that he knows he won't run into his landlord, but he still sneaks out. He's too afraid to sleep on the streets, so instead he heads to the 24-hour laundromat 2 blocks over and does a single load of laundry with a shirt and a pair of socks. It's a waste of money, but the no loitering sign spooks him. He wouldn't mind too much if they were stolen while he sleeps, but he curls tightly around his duffel and backpack protectively. With any luck, the nice family he works for will let him stash his duffel bag there in the tiny office until he can't hide it away in his locker at Yuuei for safekeeping, until he figures out what the hell he's going to do. They do, and thankfully they don't ask any questions. He knows they want to. He can practically see the worried inquiries on the tips of their tongues, but they don't speak about him, and he's not sure if he's glad that they don't or upset about it. Oboro knows there's something up. He is sure everyone knows there's something up with Izuku. He can see it in the way that his classmates peer silently at him, in the way that the teachers watch him when he's not looking. He knows Hisashi and Shota are oh so close to figuring things out, They talk. He sees the gears in their heads turning, but they're still so far away from taking the plunge into helping Izuku. Even All Might seems to be catching on to the fact that Izuku isn't right. But still, no one says anything. The teachers turn a blind eye, waiting for him to go to them, which is so stupid. The students watch from afar, but they never try to help. He's honestly not sure how well these kids will do in the Hero Course program if they can't look at their peer, their friend, and see him struggling. He wishes he could do more. He'd been trying. He's been trying his hardest to get Hisashi and Shota thinking about Izuku any opportunity that he got. He'd rearranged their markings so that Izuku's name and papers were always on top. He did it to both of them, every time he could. There wasn't a whole lot that he could do, especially without Izuku by his side, but he was trying so damn hard. The look on their faces every time they settled down to do their markings, and Izuku's paper is always on the top of their pile. And he's made sure it really is, every time. Would have been funny if it weren't for the fact that no one was getting his messages, no one was helping, no one was looking into the green-haired teen. Surely, everyone was seeing what he was seeing, right? How the teen was running himself into the ground, how his focus was wavering in classes and practice, and just in general conversation. How he was wavering. How his training was getting sloppy, how he was messing up more than these past few weeks than he had been since the start of the year. Was no one seeing it? It had been a full week of Izuku steadily declining. He wasn't okay. He was far from it. But every time that Oboro brought it up, the teen would snap at him, avoid the instigation, and direct the conversation elsewhere. And there wasn't a whole lot that he could do to counter it. He was a ghost. It's not like he could grab a hold of the teen and shake him out of the I need to deal with this solely on my own mindset, especially when Izuku was. Was he blocking the connection between them? Subconsciously capping it off again like he'd been doing since he was a tyke? All Oboro knew was that he wasn't feeling the same around his green-haired friend recently as he had been before. What was he supposed to do? Izuku had been weird for a full week now. That Sunday, when Izuku shows up to his quirk training, Oboro can only watch from afar as his heart nearly shatters. The teen had been almost pulling away from him as the days carried on. He wasn't ignoring him, but he wasn't acknowledging him either. There was hardly a moment to talk. Izuku was busy, and Oboro knew that he couldn't overstep, not with his friend already on edge. The kid looks awful. He's got bags under his eyes, dark enough that they rival Shota's. He's slow and tired. Lethargic, even. Shota's well enough now, and most of his bandages have come off, that they're sparring even, working on some of their hand-to-hand combat. Oboro can see Shota holding back his attacks, blank face so close to breaking in concern. He can see the twitch of his school friend's eyebrow, how his lip quirks downward each time that he sends Izuku sprawled onto the mats with what should have been an easily avoidable attack. Each time the teenager hits the mat, it takes him a few more seconds to pull himself up. Oboro's counting them each time. First it was 5, then 13, 20, 32, and then a full minute before he's even forcing his eyes open. The kid is so tired, like he hasn't been sleeping, and maybe he hasn't. Oboro doesn't know. He's been kept at arm's length, and it's not like they'd been following their routine with Izuku's new job stealing his attention after school. "We're done, kid." Shota's voice had softened, but it's only heard to a trained ear. It's that softness that he'd use on Hisashi when he'd got worked up, or his quirk would slip accidentally and he felt bad. It probably sounds no different to the green-haired kid, though. "You're not up to it today." "I am," Izuku wheezes, and that alone, and also in addition to the fact that he's sprawled on his back, trying to catch his breath, really contradicts the words. I'm okay, Sensei. I'm fine. Let's keep going." "No." Shota cuts the kid off with a shake of his head, arms crossing over his chest. "When we decided on these additional training sessions, I told you I'd veto them if I thought you were injured or a danger to yourself, and guess what, Midoriya? You're a danger to yourself. Clearly, these weekend training sessions are too much." "They're not," the teen whines tiredly. "I'm fine." "No, you're not," Shota sighs. "I'm not sure what's going on with you, kid, but something's not right. Was there anything you wanted to talk about? Anything I should know?" "I'm fine. I'm fine, Sensei, I promise." Izuku bows his head. Nothing you should know. I'm okay." "Midoriya." There's a hint of warning in his tone. "You're obviously not. You've been down for 2 minutes now. These are easily avoidable attacks. We're warming up. I've seen you dodge swifter and wilier attacks without a thought. You're not okay. You're... The teen swallows, finally pushing himself up so he's sitting on the mat instead of laying on it. His eyes are dull, and Obero's not even sure with what. You're just hard to predict, Sensei, that's all. Shota's quiet for a second before he sighs. He scratches his scalp idly, taking care not to mess up the bun that he'd put his hair up into, in order to keep it out of his face while they sparred. That may be so, but you're also out of it. You're a liability like this, problem child. I can't in good conscience let you keep going. If you keep up with the warm-ups, or you can't do it, I can't or won't keep pushing you and expecting a different result. It's counterproductive and illogical. You're tired, and I know tired, kid. You need to get some rest. The teen just glares down at his lap, bottom lip caught between his teeth. It's not directed at anyone, and Obero can see Shota sees that as well, because the man doesn't comment on it like he usually would. We're done for today, and until I see you taking care of yourself, we won't have another training session. I'm not going to stand back and watch you run yourself into the ground. I won't teach that. You're walking a fine line, Midoriya. Don't keep pushing like this, or you'll burn yourself out. You're canceling tomorrow's quirk training. There's a desperation in the teen's voice, a waver. Shota definitely hears it, but doesn't comment on it. Obero bites his lip to keep himself quiet. He thinks Izuku's forgotten he's even there. What about Wednesday? We'll see, Shota frowns, watching as the kid finally stumbles to a wobbly standing form. Show me you're rested and taking care of yourself. Show me you're able to keep up with the class tomorrow, and we'll go see where we stand with Wednesday. Now go, get some rest. I'll see you tomorrow. Izuku does leave, bowing his head with a quiet, yes, Sensei, before disappearing into the locker room. Obero heaves out an unsteady breath as he watches Shota. The teacher is staring at the doorway that Izuku had just disappeared through, eyes locked on it, unblinking. The man drags his attention away, shaking his head as he leans down to stack up pick up the mats. Just what's going on with you, problem child? Obero would very much like to know the answer to that as well. Izuku is gone by the time Obero makes his way into the locker room. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes that he stood stiffly by his school friend, watching the dark-haired man stew thoughtfully as he cleaned up the mats. Obero bites his lip, shaking his head. He knew he should have followed right behind Izuku. Now the teen could be anywhere. He almost wished that he'd just gone against Izuku's will and followed him to his new job. Maybe then he'd know where he was. Maybe he'd feel a bit better. Shota had told Izuku to rest, but if Obero knew anything about the kid, he knew he wasn't going to. He knew he'd be on his way to work now because he worked every day, apparently. It was no wonder that the kid looked like death standing. All he could do now was head to Izuku's apartment and wait for him to come home. It had been a few days since the ghost had gone to Izuku's apartment. He wasn't the kind of guy to go where he wasn't wanted, and a small part of him knew that Izuku didn't really want him around. But he was getting concerned. He needed to corner the teen and find out what the hell was going on. He'd let it go too far, had watched without helping longer than he should have. Obero made his way down the familiar roads, phases, through the apartment's building doors, before walking up the stairs to Izuku's floor. He knows he could have just appeared in Izuku's apartment, but the other teen probably isn't even there, and this at least gives him something to do. A noise startles Obero from his thoughts. He freezes outside of Izuku's door. There's someone inside? He leans through the door, sticking his head in, but just as he does so, the door opens and suddenly someone's walking through him. Geez, a voice yelps, but Obero is overcome by an uncomfortable sickness as the surprise of someone unexpectedly phasing through him surges through him as well. Oi, watch the cold spot. If you make me drop this couch on my feet, I'll kill you. I got it, another voice scoffs. It's just then that Obero realizes he stood in the middle of Izuku's moving couch. He just barely manages to jump out of the way as the second body comes towards him. He gapes at the men as they carry the couch out the door and down the hallway. He's glad no one can see him because he's pretty sure he looked like a fish or something, stood there like an idiot. What? Obero whispers to himself, finally spinning to walk into the apartment. Izuku is moving? Why hadn't he told him? There's not just those two people, there's a bunch, a team. There's people boxing up Izuku's things, others taking the photos and any decor off the walls. He cranes his neck to see two people in the kitchen, tossing things into the garbage bags. They empty the cupboards and fridge. He takes a nervous step towards Izuku's room, noting how his room is mostly untouched. Some of the things are missing, but the majority is still there. "What about the kids' room?" a voice calls, and it's just then that Oboro realizes there's someone beside him, leaning into the room. "We taking it apart too?" "Taking it apart?" "Yeah, just..." A new man joins him, eyes scanning the room with an uncertain look. "Pack it up, but keep everything but the furniture. He's a good kid. I'll store it for now." "He's... what? What is going on?" Oboro stares at the man, who's obviously in charge. His voice is soft in his eyes as he looks around the room again, and the man and a woman now step in with boxes. Then his gaze darts down to a paper in his hand, a paper that Oboro hadn't noticed before. Maybe he'd pulled it out of his pocket. Curiosity piqued at the sight of Izuku's formal writing. He leans over to read. It's an apology letter. It's not very descriptive, doesn't explain much, doesn't give any clear indication of the confusion that Oboro is feeling up, but it's honest and respectful. Izuku's sorry for not managing rent, and he's sorry for leaving everything for this man, his landlord, Oboro starts to realize, to dispose of. It all crashes down around him. Izuku wasn't here. Izuku hadn't been here. These people were tearing his apartment apart, probably in preparation for a now new renter that was coming in. Izuku didn't have an apartment anymore. If he did, he would have brought all of his stuff. He and his mother. Izuku didn't have a home anymore. Where was his mother? How could she let this happen? How could she... What had happened? And where the hell was Izuku? Oboro would never admit that he was a nervous mess as Monday rolled around. He'd stayed in the apartment all day watching them tear it apart. He wishes that he knew where the green-haired teen was, but he doesn't. If he did know, then he'd be there instead of standing around watching this all unfold like an idiot. He watched the furniture leave and the trash bags of stuff filled and walked out, Izuku and his mother's possessions being thrown into trash bags like they're nothing more than literal trash. Oboro swears that his stomach is in his throat as he watches Izuku's apartment, his life, be uprooted and stolen away. Thank God he hadn't had to watch as Izuku's room and personal possessions got the same treatment. He wasn't sure he'd be able to handle all that. The moving company had taken everything to be either resold or even thrown away. Oboro didn't know. Everything but Izuku's belongings, which he'd followed up a few flights of stairs, as the landlord had said they'd be packed up in 4 neatly packed boxes and tucked away in the landlord's apartment close by for safekeeping. Oboro watched as a cleaning company came through, washing walls, cleaning the bathrooms when everything was gone. It wasn't dirty by any means, but he knew that things had to be incredibly clean. He remembers moving when he was little. They'd only moved once, but his mother had stressed herself out making sure everything was tidy before they did. By the time night falls, Oboro wasn't feeling much. He hadn't been this disconnected from the living world since just after he died. It's a strange feeling. He seeks out his friends, catches Hisashi as he arrives home from his own evening weekend patrol downtown. The blond man collapses onto the bed, groaning into the covers, which prompts a huff of laughter out of Shota, who's in the process of zipping up his jumpsuit. Oboro almost smiles at the exchange. Oboro watches Hisashi lay relaxed on the bed until he hears the front door open and close, which at that point he spins around to follow Shota. He follows behind Shota on the man's patrol, a little closer than he usually tends to. Occasionally his dark-haired friend would shiver, but he'd just tuck into the capture weapon and carry on. His patrol was slow and there wasn't much activity. By the time the sun was rising above them and the early hours of the morning creeped up, Oboro felt exhausted. He was more tired than he'd been after the USJ, and he hadn't even done anything. It had been years since emotional exhaustion had washed over him like this. He hadn't even felt like this after he'd died. He was confused and worried, concerned for his friend. He didn't know where Izuku was. He didn't know if he was okay. Didn't know how long he had been dealing with this silently, behind closed doors, refusing to let anyone in to help. How long had he not had a home? Oboro feels like the worst friend ever. He'd noticed the changes, but he never would have thought it would be this bad. Izuku was homeless as far as he could see. His mother was wherever the hell she was. He'd seen how absent she was, but this was a whole new level of absent. They'd lost their apartment. She hadn't paid the rent. Obero's never even met the lady, but the thought of her made his stomach roll unpleasantly. Obero looks over at Izuku, and he looks the worst that he's seen him in a while, as he stumbles his way into English class. And what's worse is he ignores him. Completely ignores him. For a second, Obero thinks that maybe Izuku can't hear him anymore, can't see him, and he panics before he sees Izuku's eyebrow twitch in annoyance. The fact that he's ignoring him stings more than it probably should. He's used to being ignored as a ghost, but even when he was alive. Shota put up a good fight, pretending Obero and the majority of their friend group didn't exist at one point or another, but he'd never been this ignored by Izuku. He chalks it up to Izuku being tired, or he hopes it's just because he's tired. Still, he doesn't stop trying. He follows the teen to every class, which he'd never done. He trails after him silently as Izuku makes his way to the cafeteria. He grabs lunch, but falls asleep at the table instead of eating it. His friends, Ida and Ochako, as well as a couple of other kids that he still doesn't really know, frown and whisper hushed concerns amongst them. But no matter how hard Obero tries to get them to ask Izuku questions, through nothing more than sheer mind power, they don't. The kid sleeps through lunch. He startles awake by Ida's hand on his shoulder just before the bell rings, but he laughs it off tiredly. He dumps his lunch into the garbage, completely untouched, before following his friends to class with nothing more than a glance at Obero, who'd been stood awkwardly behind him. Obero stood back, waited for Izuku to come to him, but he was at the end of his rope. He can't just watch anymore. "What is going on with you?" he asked desperately, as he falls into step with his friend. Shota had just benched the teen, and the terrifying part was that Izuku had hardly put up a fight, had stared unseeing back at the man who had leveled him a vicious, annoyed glare at the fact that his suggestion of rest from the previous morning had been ignored. Obero's going to take a guess and say Wednesday's extra training is probably cancelled. It takes Izuku a second to reply, and he's not completely sure if his friend is debating ignoring him some more, or if he's just that groggy that he doesn't automatically realize that he'd even been spoken to. "What? What's going on with you?" the ghost repeats, trying to keep the exasperation from his voice. He wonders if he should just up and say it, ask about the fact that he'd watched the landlord gut the apartment, but he thinks that might be a bit harsh. "I've barely seen you." "I see you every day at school, and I saw you yesterday, too. You're being a little dramatic. Besides, you know where I've been. I've been working. Sorry, I don't have much time to spend with you, but I've got stuff to take care of." "That didn't count as seeing you," Obero snapped. "Sho had to send you home because you could hardly keep yourself upright. You didn't so much as look at me at all, and you've been ignoring me all day, hell, all week. Are you mad at me or something? Did I do something?" "No," Izuku scoffs, looking a bit surprised at the accusation. He seems to shake the surprise off with a shake of his head, continuing with a heavy, almost annoyed sigh. "I'm not ignoring you. Maybe I'm just having a bad day. Ever thought of that? Not everything has to do with you, Obero. I have some problems outside of whatever this is." "A bad day?" Obero narrows his eyes. "Izuku, you've been acting weird for days." "So?" Izuku hisses. "I've been weird a few days. Who cares?" "I care!" Obero shouts fiercely. "I know what's happened. Izuku, I saw it. I went to your apartment yesterday. I saw those people in there. I saw the note you left. Where the hell have you been?" "You saw it?" Izuku's tone is icy, like Obero had struck a nerve. He doesn't know what the nerve is, but it's too late to start treading carefully in this conversation. It's hard to unstep on a landmine already underfoot. "Why can't you just stay out of my business? If I wanted you involved, I would have told you." "You're homeless," Obero fires back. "How am I supposed to stay out of that? Where have you been staying? Where have you been sleeping? I'm worried about you, Izuku. I can't just ignore this. I'm worried." Izuku's nose wrinkles like he'd been trying not to scowl. "What's this matter to you anyways?" "What's it matter to me?" Obero jerks back in surprise, knowing his voice raises as he forces out a reply. "We're friends. That's why. I care what happens to you. You're my friend. Of course it matters to me." "Are we?" Izuku snaps back under his breath. "'Cause it sure doesn't feel like it." What? Obero takes a tiny step backwards, but it seems that Izuku is fired up, glaring at him. "You heard me," the boy barks out, eyes glowing with frustration. "I don't know you. I know nothing about you. You're cryptic and you don't let me in. You know everything about me. Like, literally everything now, because you can't keep your nose out of my business, yet the only things that you tell me are things I need to know. And even then, you hardly even tell me anything that's about that stuff either. It's not fair. That's not what friends do. So, are we really friends? Huh? Are we? Oboro swallows. It feels like someone just dumped a bucket of ice water over his head. Izuku had been sitting on this the whole time. He knows he doesn't share a lot of himself, but most of it isn't important. He's a ghost. He barely exists out of Izuku's realm. He doesn't remember ever refusing to answer a question, besides that one about his friends, Izuku's teachers, but that's not Oboro's secret to share. He doesn't even remember Izuku asking him any questions, besides that day they had laid it all out on the table after the USJ. He'd answered the questions, he'd told Izuku what he knew, so where was this coming from? We are friends, Oboro manages out weakly, glancing at the other teen. I'm just trying to... Yeah, well, stop, Izuku hisses, hands clenched into his shaking fists at his side. Just leave me alone. Midoriya! Shota's voice booms from where he was still on the floor with the students. Oboro had honestly forgotten that they were all there, his friend and Izuku's classmates. And if, by the way, Izuku jolts upright, looking the most awake that he'd seen him all week, he can assume that the same goes for the teen. Izuku's cheeks blood red, nervous eyes casting all around at the eyes that were on him. His cheeks only seem to darken when he notices everyone's looking at him, staring, and Oboro can only wonder how much that they'd heard. His heart pounds in his chest, sharing Izuku's anxiety of it while simultaneously breaking because he doesn't have to deal with the repercussions of this like Izuku does. Shota looks more concerned than he does angry. Oboro can see it even from the distance. His tone had been sharp, piercing the air, but there was an undertone of cautious concern. Oboro knows that Shota isn't upset, but he's sure Izuku can't see anything past the embarrassment consuming him. The green-haired teen launches to his feet, sprinting out of the training gym without a word. His classmates call to him. Some even step to follow, but he doesn't stop or even slow down in the slightest. The gym doors bang shut behind him, and they ring on Oboro's ears as a heavy silence blanketed over them. Leave him, the teacher growls, thankfully on top of his class and already predicting their movements. He instantly gains everyone's attention, and those who'd been moving freeze abruptly. But Sensei, leave him, Shota repeats stiffly, leaving no room for any additional complaints. Back to sparring, all of you. Let's go before I make you run drills instead. Don't test me. The students remain frozen for another long second before returning to their spars. No one wants to push Aizawa, and it's definitely a good call. Oboro remains rooted where he is, stuck exactly where he'd been when he'd taken that step away from his friend. His brain is still reeling from it all as he tries to figure out how he'd fuck this up so extraordinarily bad. He can't force himself to move. I hope Midobro is okay. Oboro hears distantly, and he thinks it's the kid with the spiky red hair. Maybe. Without looking, it's hard to match faces to voices or names to faces, too. Shitty Deku. Don't worry about him. He's always been like that. Oboro frowns. That almost sounds nice. Always been a fucking freak show. Never mind. He's never wanted to punch a kid as much as he wants to punch Bakugo. Man, you're always so harsh, Bakubro. Shut up and spar, Shota snaps at the two of them, unless you'd like to do some suicide sprints, because I can arrange that. If Oboro weren't feeling so gutted, he probably would have laughed at the redhead sputtering and Bakugo's huff of apologetic, bordering, annoyed submission as he launched back into a sparring stance. The saving grace of Aizawa Shota. This concludes Chapter 10 of Yuuei Survival Guide. That was such a tough one. I'll be back with Chapter 11 for you guys as soon as possible. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.